It is the skeleton of every new house, the frame of the American dream. From the suburbs of California to the Carolinas, a vital artery of North American commerce provides the lumber. Nearly a third of it, 28 million cubic meters a year, flows south from the vast forests of Canada. But in the summer of 2025, a presidential tariff turned this vital trade into the front line of a bitter economic war. A move designed to punish Canada instead handed its provinces a chokehold on the American housing market. How did an attempt to protect American sawmills end up putting the entire American dream on the chopping block? To understand why this fight cuts so deep, you have to understand the grain of the relationship. For decades, the flow of Canadian softwood lumber into the United States wasn't just trade, it was a foundational element of American prosperity. The U.S. has a massive housing market, but simply doesn't have the domestic sawmill capacity or sustainable forestry resources to satisfy its own voracious appetite for wood. Canada, with its vast, well-managed forests, filled the gap. This created a deeply integrated symbiotic relationship. An American home builder could place an order, and a shipment of spruce, pine, or fir from a Canadian mill would arrive predictably and affordably. It was a smooth, efficient system that kept the cost of building new homes in check and fueled the post-war suburban expansion. However, this seemingly peaceful trade has been punctuated by decades of bitter disputes. The softwood lumber dispute is one of the longest-running trade battles in modern history. The core of the conflict lies in a fundamental difference in how the two countries manage their forests. In the U.S., most timber is harvested from private lands. In Canada, it's largely harvested from government-owned Crown lands. American producers have long argued that the fees Canada charges its logging companies are artificially low, amounting to an unfair subsidy. This has led to multiple rounds of U.S.-imposed tariffs, followed by lengthy legal challenges and negotiated settlements. By August of 2024, the U.S. had already doubled the existing tariff from around 8% to 14.54%. This constant conflict created a baseline of tension and distrust. It forced Canadian producers to become adept at navigating trade law and diversifying their markets, while American builders grew weary of the price volatility. The stage was already set for a major escalation. All it needed was a spark. The spark became an inferno in July 2025. Frustrated with what it saw as Canadian intransigence, the Trump administration dropped a bombshell on the North American housing market. It announced its intent to more than double the already contentious lumber tariff, raising it from 14.54% to a crippling 35% on all Canadian softwood imports. This wasn't a negotiating tactic. It was designed as a knockout blow. The stated goal was to protect the remaining U.S. sawmills and force a fundamental shift in the supply chain, compelling American builders to source their wood domestically. The policy was a direct appeal to a small but politically vocal group of U.S. lumber producers who had long lobbied for protection from their Canadian counterparts. In the administration's view, any negative impact on the broader construction industry was a necessary price to pay to achieve the America First goal of reviving a domestic industry. The reaction from the markets was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. The Dow Jones Home Construction Index plunged 8% as investors priced in the devastating impact of a massive increase in building material costs. Lumber futures, a key indicator of where the industry thinks prices are heading, shot up, with analysts predicting a surge to between $650 and $765 per thousand board feet, levels that would bring new home construction to a grinding halt. The National Association of Home Builders, NAHB, representing the very businesses at the heart of the American dream, sounded the alarm. They warned that the existing tariffs had already added between $7,500 and $10,000 to the price of an average new single-family home. A 35% tariff would blow those numbers out of the water, pricing millions of American families out of the market entirely. The fundamental flaw in the administration's logic was that it ignored a basic reality. the United States simply cannot meet its own demand for lumber. As warned by industry analysts at ResourceWise, the country relies on Canada for nearly a third of its supply, a staggering 28 million cubic meters per year. Domestic sawmills, hampered by labor shortages, logging restrictions, and the ever-present threat of wildfires, have no physical way to ramp up production quickly enough to fill that massive gap. The policy didn't just target a foreign supplier, it targeted the basic laws of supply and demand. Canada's response was a masterful display of strategic patience and provincial power. There were no immediate, headline-grabbing retaliatory tariffs from the federal government in Ottawa. Instead, the real action took place in the provincial capitals of British Columbia and Ontario, where the forests are actually managed. In a public statement reported by Bloomberg, BC Premier David Eby calmly announced that his province was now considering limiting softwood lumber exports to the U.S. It was a carefully worded threat, a clear signal that if the U.S. wanted to play hardball, Canada held the ultimate trump card, the ability to turn off the tap. But the more immediate and powerful move came from Ontario. While never making a formal announcement, sources within the industry confirmed that the provincial government, which controls the allocation of timber on Crown lands, began to quietly turn the valve. They started to subtly slow down the approval of cutting permits and reallocate timber towards mills that were producing higher value, finished wood products like engineered flooring and furniture components. This two-pronged strategy was brilliant. First, by simply reducing the volume of raw lumber available for export, Ontario created a real immediate supply shock to the U.S. market, far more effective than any tariff. It let the market itself punish the American construction industry, making the 35% tariff almost irrelevant. Second, by encouraging a shift to value-added manufacturing, they were playing a long game. These finished products were often exempt from the crude softwood tariffs and could be sold to new growing markets under Canada's free trade agreements with Europe's CETA and the Pacific nations' CPTPP. The strategy was clear. If the U.S. was going to be an unreliable partner for raw materials, then Canada would stop being a simple resource colony. It would start making the final products itself and sell them to the rest of the world. It was a quiet declaration of economic independence, a strategic pivot designed to permanently reduce its reliance on the volatile American market. This placed the American construction industry in an impossible position. They were caught in a trade war they didn't want, facing a crisis with no easy solution. The White House was fixated on punishing Canada, seemingly indifferent to the collateral damage inflicted on its own home builders. The logical alternative sources simply didn't exist. As Reuters pointed out, all of the lumber imported from alternative sources like Germany and Sweden in 2023 amounted to just 3.5 million cubic meters, a drop in the bucket compared to the 28 million cubic meter hole that a Canadian embargo would create. Not to mention the higher shipping costs and longer lead times. American home builders were trapped. They couldn't get enough wood from domestic sources. The Canadian supply was being deliberately choked off, and overseas alternatives were too little, too late. The American dream of home ownership was now hostage to a trade dispute, with no resolution in sight. For Canada's lumber industry, the U.S. tariffs, while painful in the short term, acted as a powerful catalyst for a necessary evolution. For years, the industry had been criticized for relying too heavily on exporting raw, unfinished lumber to the U.S. The 35% tariff was the final push needed to accelerate a long-term strategic shift towards value-added manufacturing. Instead of just sending 2x4s south, Canadian mills invested in the technology and skills to turn that same wood into higher-margin products like prefabricated housing components, cross-laminated timber, and high-end furniture. This strategy had multiple benefits. It created more skilled, higher-paying jobs within Canada, moving the country up the economic value chain. It also allowed producers to tap into new markets. While raw lumber faced tariffs, These finished goods often qualified for duty-free access to the European Union and the fast-growing economies of the Asia-Pacific through the CETA and CPTPP trade agreements. The crisis forced the industry to innovate and diversify, while individual sawmill towns in British Columbia and Ontario that were heavily reliant on the U.S. market faced immediate hardship and uncertainty. The national strategy was one of building a more resilient, sophisticated, and globally oriented wood products sector, one that would be permanently less vulnerable to the political whims of its southern neighbor. The consumer sentiment shift was also palpable. A Dunnhumby survey in May 2025 revealed that 71% of Canadians plan to buy fewer American goods, a grassroots reaction that put further pressure on cross-border retailers and American brands. In the United States, the impact was felt directly in the wallets of ordinary Americans. The dream of homeownership, already a stretch for many, was pushed even further out of reach. The NAHB's estimate of a $7,500 to $10,000 price increase per new home wasn't a hypothetical number. It was a real barrier for families trying to buy their first house. This was compounded by rising interest rates, creating a brutal double whammy for potential buyers. The economic damage spread far beyond the construction site. The Yale Budget Lab issued a chilling forecast. If the full suite of 2025 tariffs were implemented, it could permanently reduce the size of the U.S. economy by 0.45% every year, a loss of about $135 billion annually. For the average American household, this translated to a direct cost of about $2,800 per year in higher prices and reduced purchasing power. The pain was acute in border communities. In border cities like Buffalo, New York, where Canadian shoppers are a vital part of the local economy, retail sales plummeted. By mid-February 2025, cross-border traffic had already fallen, contributing to a 7% drop in local tax revenue. The policy designed to protect a few thousand jobs in U.S. sawmills was now actively harming the millions employed in construction, costing families thousands of dollars and strangling the economies of border towns. And so, North America stands at a crossroads it never anticipated. A trade war over a foundational commodity has forced a painful reckoning. The United States, in an attempt to shield a domestic industry, has instead driven up the cost of the American dream and inflicted deep pain on its own construction sector. Canada, backed into a corner, has responded not with loud rhetoric, but with a quiet, powerful strategic pivot, retooling its industry for a global future that is less dependent on its southern neighbor. The integrated lumber market that built a continent has been irrevocably splintered. In the race to define the future, will North America win together, or will both sides lose trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.